All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the OFPA June webinar. Today, our topic is allergen control, challenges, perspectives, and solutions. My name is Nadia Narain. I am the current president for the OFPA. I'm thrilled to have Deb here today to speak with us. She's in Norway. Is Norway
Uh,
right now? You're in
Denmark. Close,
Denmark.
very close.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Denmark. Sorry, Denmark. Apologies, Denmark. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to do this for us. Um, so today, just very quickly, the presentation is going to be providing an overview of the current situation regarding allergen threshold limits and control legislation, strategies and approaches for managing the associated risks, developments in allergen management in food processing, recommended cleaning practices, hygiene design, how to monitor, verify, validate allergen cleaning. So a lot of really great information. A little bit about Deb. So Deb has almost 40 years of food safety and research training and experience. Deb and I have known each other for quite some time now. We met at IFP, which is what we've been talking about, which is going to be here in Toronto this year. So it's really great to work with you again. Prior to joining Viken, she worked as a microbiologist at a large poultry production site with the UK government as a scientific officer in the food safety division and as a food hygiene research manager at Camden BRI. Deb holds qualifications in applied micro, nutrition and food science, advanced food hygiene, and HACCP. She is also a qualified FSSC 22000 lead auditor. Uh, Deb has been a member of IFP for nearly 20 years and is the UK IFP affiliate committee treasurer. She is also an active committee member of the EHEDG, the UK and IE regional section, and the IFST scientific committee. She is also a fellow of the IFST, a director of or at SOFHT and current chair of the microbiology MIG at Camden BRI. When do you sleep? Um,
A bit crazy.
um, so Deb regularly presents her research at national and international food safety events and has authored and co-authored on numerous food safety and hygiene publications, including peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, and several food industry hygiene guidelines. So it is a really, really great honor to have you today, speaking to all of us. I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nadia. And thank you to all of you who have joined us here today. So we're going to talk about allergens, and I'd like to start my presentation with a short video, just to warn you that it is quite hard hitting, but I don't make any apologies for its content.
Actually, Deb, before we do the video, I just remembered, would you mind if we try to do that screenshot that I was talking about?
Of course, yeah, no, go for it.
Okay. If everyone doesn't mind, if we can just really quickly turn on our cameras, just so we can get a screenshot, I would really, really appreciate it for the OFPA. And if I can figure out how to display all of you, that'll be my next challenge. Let's see here, side by side speaker. No. Huh. Yep, there's still people popping in. You know what? Maybe we'll have to do this at the end because I'm not very good at this. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I figured it out. Yay me.
Well done.
Hey, I never said I was an IT expert. All right, everyone. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Okay, so we can continue.
Okay, so here comes that hard hitting video. Don't know if you're getting any sound, Nadia.
Nope, there's no sound on our end.
Never mind, I think the pictures say what needs to be said. So the apologies for no sound, it's even more dramatic with the sound, but the young lady in that video was suffering a anaphylactic shock because the young lad that she kissed had eaten something that she was allergic to. Now, I know that that's not indicative of allergen cross-contact in food production, but I think it gets across the message just how devastating contact with a food allergen can be for a sensitive consumer. Fortunately, not all reactions are that acute, but that one was an anaphylactic shock, and that is one of the most severe reactions that can be experienced by a sensitive individual. And it's what we call a true allergic reaction, and those are characterized by an immunological response. I always have trouble with that word, to a protein. But sufferers can also suffer from, or consumers can also suffer from food intolerances, which are usually due to a lack of an enzyme to digest or metabolize a food component, such as lactose sugars in milk, celiac disease, which is an autoimmune response triggered by gluten, and chemical sensitivity, for example, to things like sulfites in wine. Okay, now I'm sure that after that video, I don't have to say too much more about the importance of allergen control, but I do have a few facts and figures for you, courtesy of Food Allergy Canada. The information on their website indicates that food allergens are a significant public health issue in Canada, and that 3 million Canadians self-report at least one food allergy, that almost 600,000 Canadian children have food allergies, and that celiac disease affects approximately 1% of the Canadian population. So it is having a significant impact in Canada. Now, food allergens, both in Canada and globally, have a significant social and financial impact on us all. And it does appear that this impact is increasing year on year. So obviously, consequently, there are strict legal requirements both in Canada and globally to regulate allergen food safety. In Canada, Health Canada are responsible for the development and administration of health and safety policies and standards, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency are responsible for all federal food inspection service. As you can tell, I had to do a bit of research to find this information because most of my legal stuff normally relates to European or even American legislation. The Canadian Food and Drugs Act provides the overarching provision for food safety, and the Canadian Food and Drug Regulation Part B provides the information for specific food types and ingredients. Now, the key section that I could find to be aware of is 5.1, which states, and I won't read it out, but basically that the food we sell needs to be safe and not be misinterpreted or missold to the public. And in addition to the legal requirements, if any of you are working to or auditing for or be audited against the 3 largest global food safety standards, they also require risk-based allergen management systems. So let's look at the basics of risk-based allergen management. Obviously, hazard identification is related to the allergens, and for each of those, we need to know the known or potential health effects associated with them. Knowing those things, we can then conduct a risk assessment. That's easier said than done. Once we've identified the risks, we need to implement the validated controls to prevent, eliminate, or reduce them to an acceptable level. And having implemented those controls, we then need to monitor or verify those measures to ensure that they are being consistently applied. But as I mentioned, when it comes to allergens, we have a number of challenges. So although you have 11 priority allergens in Canada, allergens around the world differ. So not everybody's list of allergens is the same. In addition to that, the potential health effects that they have on people is also very variable. And there's a lack of likelihood and severity data around that because of the variability. The allergens we're trying to control are very often a natural component of the food that we're trying to produce. So trying to prevent, eliminate, or reduce it can be quite tricky. And there is also a lack of qualitative and quantitative data on acceptable dose. I'm just going to have to move my screen here a little. And also on a lack of definitive limits. And that's been one of the biggest points of discussion over the last few years. So thankfully, there are many organisations working hard to try and provide data and information to inform allergen risk assessments. And in 2000, ILSI, who are the International Life Science Institute, published the findings of a consultation exercise where they asked the question, can we define a level of protection for allergenic consumers that everyone can accept? What they found was that the quantitative limits for unintended allergen presence have, in general, not been defined across or within jurisdictions. They also found that there were diverse approaches that have been adopted to define quantitative limits for other food safety hazards, but how those decisions were reached that we could then use for allergens was unclear. Overall, they decided that the inability to define what risk is tolerable is a major obstacle to defining the limits that we want to set for allergens. And really that these should be determined through consensus based on prevalence, severity, and potency. As a result of the consultation, they proposed a framework for transparent decisions on risk tolerability, founded on full participation of stakeholders. And I know that the Canadian government are involved in this process. They established a food allergen task force, and they have produced a number of useful publications, which I've listed for you on the slide, related to quantitative risk assessment, which I hope you'll find useful. So one of the key questions in determining allergen risk is how much is too much? Now, we're aware, for example, that peanut allergy patients have different levels of sensitivity, but you might be surprised at just how much peanut is required to elicit a response. 0.4 milligrams of peanut, which you can see circled here in the red, is the amount that elicits a response in the most sensitive peanut allergic patients reported in the published clinical literature. And it remains the smallest amount of peanut known to provoke an objective reaction in trials of nearly 2,000 peanut allergen individuals. So that begs the question, if you can see that amount of protein, see the amount of peanut, is cleaning to a visible standard acceptable for peanut? Another challenge we have is that not all allergens are created equal. So here on this dose versus response curve, you can see in green for soya, that is much lower in terms of dose response than for egg, which is shown in black. Now, another group that are working hard to try to inform allergen risk assessments are the Allergen Bureau of Australia and New Zealand. They have developed the Voluntary Incidental Trace Allergen Labelling Program, or VITAL. And I'm sure that if you're interested in allergens, you will have heard VITAL spoken about before. So VITAL suggests the total minimum amount of allergen necessary in a whole serving to cause a reaction in 95 to 99% of allergen sufferers, at or below which voluntary labelling is unnecessary. The equation used to determine the action limit takes the reference dose in milligrams divided by the portion size in kilograms. So it's sometimes quite difficult to appreciate that. So I've got an example here for you. If you take a chocolate bar that weighs 100 grams, which is 0.1 of a kilogram, and the reference dose for peanut is 0.1 milligram, which you can see in the table provided by VITAL, then the action limit for peanut would be 0.1 divided by 0.1, which would give 1 milligram per kilogram. So that's a summary of what we've looked at in terms of risk assessment. What can we do on a more practical level to help control allergens? And many of these controls are similar to the ones that we use for microbial control. The main differences are that sometimes we knowingly bring allergens into our food production area, and we can't use chemicals to kill them. The three key focus areas, which I've color coded here, starting with purple, are preventing entry of a controlled allergen into the area where they're not allowed. And then secondly, in red, prevention of allergen cross-contamination or cross-contact. And then finally, in green, the correct allergen labeling. If we can take as many steps within those three major steps as possible to minimize allergen cross-contact or mislabeling, then will actually help to minimize the risk to the consumer. I'm going to take you through each of these now and highlight some of the things that you can do to maximize your allergen control. So we'll start with preventing entry. And here we need to consider everything from raw materials and packaging supplies to machinery-free, allergen-free machinery lubricants. We also need to consider the process flow and control regarding the segregation of areas and equipment used to control the allergen processing, and the point at which the allergen is introduced into the product, preferably at the latest point in the process. We also have to think about controlled rework. And we also have to think about new product development to restrict the introduction of new allergens. And that's also something that needs to be considered in relation to any on-site catering facilities. If we move on now to look at control of cross-contact, and this is a much larger area, so we're going to go into a bit more detail. It really requires a multi-factored approach, including the consideration of the following. So hygienic design. Yeah, you've heard that I'm involved with the European Hygienic Engineering Design Group. So this factors quite largely in many of my presentations, and I make no apologies for it because I do think it's a fundamental to food safety. We also need to think about the physical, spatial, or time segregation of allergen-containing materials, the cleaning, waste handling, spillage controls, and the physical removal of allergens, and systems and procedures, including the cleaning activities that restrict the movement of airborne dust and aerosols that may contain allergenic material. And last but not least, we need to think about people, and in particular, their training. So now let's have a closer look. Firstly, we'll have a look at hygienic design. Now, this is also known, you might have heard of it called sanitary design. They use that term particularly in the US. I'm not sure what you use in Canada, but hopefully you know what we mean. Hygienic design basically relates to how easy something is to decontaminate. And by making something easy to clean, it's more likely to be cleaned in a timely and effective way. Good hygienic design principles include things like the avoidance of nooks and crannies, making things of one-piece construction or easy to take apart and clean and put back together, or having a smooth surface finish. Bad hygienic design principles are where these things are neglected, and then it provides allergens with an ideal opportunity to hide in all those nooks and crannies and then be able to cross-contaminate. Good hygienic design principles have been defined and promoted by EHEG in Europe, but also by 3A in the US. EHEG published their guideline 8, which gives you the principles, which is free to download from their website, and is available in many different languages, which is quite useful. 3A also have a link to a great video, which helps. And hygienic design has really got a bit of a boost over the last few years because GFSI benchmark requirements have been released that now focus on the hygienic design of facilities and equipment. And these benchmark standards are being fed into the global food standards like those operated by BRCGS and FSSC 22000. So you will see more about hygienic design going forward. Now, given the importance of hygienic design in cross-contamination control, it's a constant surprise to me that so far the only mention of hygienic design in those GFSI benchmark food safety standards.
Even dit volgen.
So I can hear, sounds like Dutch. Anyway, they appear in the BRCGS and FSSC 22000 standards, but both are in relation to cleaning equipment. Don't ask me why, but hopefully, as I say, you'll see more about hygienic design in the standards going forward. SQF also has a mention about equipment and utensils being designed and constructed in accordance with regulatory requirements, but obviously that basically means the same thing. And section 4.6 of equipment in the new BRCGS standard has been significantly strengthened with regard to hygienic design. Despite all of that, not all equipment and facilities used in the food industry are of good hygienic design. These are just a few things that I've come across in my time wandering around factories where you can see poor design leading to contamination traps in the production environment. And I very often see cleaning equipment that has anything but good hygienic design. And all of these can lead to inadvertent allergen cross-contact. So now let's move on to segregation as part of cross-contamination or cross-contact control. Now, segregation can be achieved through physical, spatial, or time separation of allergen-containing materials. It is very unlikely that you will be able to use separate factories to process foods containing priority allergens. It's possible that you will have separate areas or rooms, but it's actually most likely that you will use separate times, lines, or equipment. And we can also use some of the process flow controls that we mentioned earlier. One of the things that I've seen that's worked really well in terms of area segregations, particularly for allergen production, is color-coded zoning, where you can segregate off that zone by color for allergen production. The equipment that's used in that area can also be color-coded, and everyone knows that maybe purple is for that controlled or priority allergen. As I mentioned, you can carry that through to color coding of the equipment and utensils that are used for in contact with the allergens, and sometimes you can get the equipment in the color you need. Alternatively, you can secondary color code using things like these rubber bands, which help to distinguish equipment used for allergens. Now, cleaning, which is actually the physical removal of the soil, is the major factor in cross-contamination control of allergens. So that needs to be effective. There are no chemical agents for removal of allergens, although I have been told that caustic chlorinated products, because they're good at protein removal, are useful. And that's because most allergens are proteins. Although chemicals, radiation, and heat may denature the protein, they may not inactivate what we call the site of allergenicity, and I've written that here. So even in a denatured protein, the active part of that allergen can still remain and can still cause issues. When it comes to allergen control through cleaning, we also need to consider that most cleaning activities can spread contamination. So although cleaning is intended to be a control, it can actually also pose a risk. And what I've done here is to rank the equipment in order of their potential to spread contamination, from something like a low risk activity like vacuuming, and wiping, up to the high-risk activities like the use of compressed air. And the trick is really to choose the cleaning equipment and method that maximizes the allergen removal, but minimizes its spread. So wet cleaning of equipment and the environment is probably the most effective in terms of allergen removal. And the type of wet cleaning you choose will depend on many things, including the type of food you're producing and the equipment that you're using to produce it. So you may need to sometimes use a combination of the methods shown on the screen at the moment. Regardless of which wet cleaning method you use, you should always be aware of the risk of allergen cross-contact via the cleaning activity itself. So for example, this is an ex-colleague of mine from Camden, and she's using coloured water sprayed into a slot drain to show how far the droplets that are generated by that high pressure hose can travel and subsequently carry contamination. This one was actually aimed at listeria spread, but if you think about the same principles involved with allergen cross-contamination. And this is the model that we developed by repeating that work over and over again. And you can see how far those droplets are being spread in a forward direction, up to 7 meters forward, and to a height of about 3.5 meters, where they can then fall back down onto food contact surfaces. So you're significantly increasing the risk of spread of whatever contamination it is when you're using things like high pressure hoses. But what if you can't wet clean and would like to minimize water use in your production, which is very topical at the moment? Well, obviously then you need to look at dry cleaning. And one of the most effective and efficient ways of dry cleaning is to use a vacuum cleaner. Now these are generally low risk activities, but which obviously work by drawing in the contamination into the vacuum and retaining it in a tank or a bag. Vacuums used for this purpose need to be certified for use in food production environments, and that's to make sure that they're explosion proof or don't create electrocution risk. Now I know that the legislation in Europe that goes with this, it's the ATEX certification, and in the US it's the NTRL certified equipment that needs to be purchased, but I don't know what it is in Canada, I'm afraid, and I couldn't find out. So hopefully, if you are interested in this, there will be a place you can go to find out how it needs to be certified for use. One of the challenges I often see associated with the color coding for segregation of allergens is that not many vacuum attachments are made in different colors. There are a few really good manufacturers in Europe that do them. And what people resort to doing is using this coloured tape to identify the difference. And obviously they aren't great, they peel, they can act as a contamination trap. So one of the things that you can also do is get those, again, as I mentioned earlier, the secondary colour coding silicone rubber bands that you can fit, which help to colour code. Wiping is also generally a low-risk activity for cleaning, and the cloths can be fabric, paper, or microfiber. Microfiber is very good at removing low levels of allergen. So once you've sort of taken off the gross debris, it almost acts like a disinfection step to remove fine particles. And it can also be used damp or dry to remove, especially damp for the stubborn or dried on contamination. And they're available in disposable and reusable options. Regardless of which type of cloth you're using, if you're using a reusable cloth, which I know, again, people are moving to from a sustainability point of view, they need to be laundered, and that laundry process must be validated for allergen removal. Okay. Scrapers are another low-risk cleaning option, and they're great for taking off stubborn or dried on allergen debris. Really, there are so many scrapers available that I'm sure it's just a matter of finding one that suits the needs to match with your equipment or your task. Some are actually available that can be fitted to extension handles, which is very helpful if you're trying to reach something that's deep inside a machine or at a height or a distance. When it comes to scrubbing and sweeping, it's all about the bristle stiffness on your brushes. So soft bristle brushes are great at removal of loose dry powders, while stiff bristle brushes are good at removing that stubborn or dried on or baked on debris. And one of the great things about working so closely with the food industry is that it's often the people that we work with that come up with the most practical tips. And here's one of them, which is that a single blade squeegee, whether it be used on the floor or on a work surface, is actually very effective at removing loose soils. And it has the advantage that it doesn't clog and it's much easier and quicker to clean. So sometimes think outside the box, don't go for a brush, go for a squeegee instead. Sweeping and scrubbing really just moves debris from one place to another until it's in a position where it can be collected. And then you can use something like a vacuum cleaner or a dustpan and brush set to gather it, even a shovel if the quantities are large, to then move it to waste. And then when it comes to allergen cleaning, I'm sure anyone who's tried to do or be a hygiene operative in the food industry knows that there are so many nooks and crannies in even the best hygienic design equipment that you need to be able to get into those with some detail brushes. And again, there are many available that help with that job. Now, compressed air is sometimes useful for detail cleaning, but its use has to be very carefully considered. You can see from the picture here, this was just a plate of flour that we put out and we shot it with compressed air. And you can see that really that flour is now spread over a much greater distance and is virtually impossible actually to gather together, which is what we try to do with sweeping and brushing. And we also did some studies where we looked at how far the particles that were generated when that happened moved and how long they stayed in the air. You can see in this graph, don't worry too much about the detail, but up the side, you've got the number of particles, and along the bottom, you've got the time that they stayed in the air. And the big particles, which are in the sort of dark red, purple, they fall out of the air quite quickly. But anything smaller hangs in the air for a long time. And we actually stopped the experiment at 16 minutes because we couldn't see any noticeable difference. And if you think how far those particles can travel in 16 minutes, and then they settle back down onto surfaces, again, with a priority allergen, it's really not controlling the situation. Now, there are many other dry cleaning techniques, such as pigging and dry particle scrubs. I haven't got time to go into all of them today. For anyone who's attending IAFP in Toronto later this year, which Nadia mentioned at the beginning, we do actually have a 2-day dry cleaning workshop prior to the actual conference, and we will be going into a lot more detail and practical workshops that involve these techniques. Regardless of which cleaning technique you choose, here are a few general rules on also how to minimize allergen cross-contact through cleaning activities. So choose the equipment and methods that maximize contamination removal and minimize its spread. Try not to clean or don't clean during open food production. If you can't do that, try to clean things as far away as possible from open product. That's spatial segregation. And clean, if you can, in physically segregated areas to protect the product from splashes or aerosols. Of course, whichever cleaning method you use, it must also be validated. And I know that this is an area where many food producers struggle, and it's because it is quite complicated. We don't have time to go into it in huge detail here, but I just want to offer you some advice in terms of what it will involve and point you in the direction of some guidance that might help you. So the method development may require a degree of trial and error to determine that consistently effective method that achieves the level of decontamination that you require. So don't be surprised if you have to go through the process a few times. And different methods may have to be developed for different equipment and surfaces, or for the same equipment and surfaces that are used for a different purpose. There are a number of analytical techniques that are available to help with the validation process, and these would include at this level lateral flow devices, ELISA, and the use of DNA. You also need to be aware that some sanitation chemicals can interfere with the analytical results, particularly of the analysis that I've just spoken about. So that should also be checked as part of the validation process. In a study we'd conducted at Camden, we looked at the effects of a 1% detergent on the detection of prawn protein extract. And as you can see, that when the detergent was present, the protein wasn't detectable. So although it was still there, and for some reason, the interference caused by the detergent meant it wasn't detected. And those false negatives are actually the worst kind, because you're then not alerted to the fact that you have a hazard present. Fortunately, there is guidance available, as I said. This is a fairly recent one that's been published by eHedge, and it is available, unfortunately, to purchase this time from their website. And it is a good one. It's very comprehensive, and I would recommend it. And don't forget to clean your cleaning tools and utensils as well. They can very quickly and easily become vectors of allergen cross-contact, especially if you use the same tools for allergen and non-allergen surface or food contact cleaning. I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend color-coded segregation of tools. But if you do, then obviously your cleaning of those tools has to be absolutely perfect. Dry cleaning of the tools is pretty simple. You can brush them, wipe them, knock them, shake them. You can also choose to replace them when they're worn or damaged. And I have seen in something like infant formula production where they're actually used once and then thrown away, so that there is absolutely no risk of either microbial or allergen cross-contamination. Or you can wet clean them, and there are a number of really good wet cleaning techniques out there. There's obviously the traditional bucket of sanitizer solution. I would recommend something like a tray washer or an industrial dishwasher, or even a washing machine. And there are washing machines that have been developed that you can use to clean your cleaning tools and utensils to remove that allergen. Again, they must be validated cleaning processes. And once you've established your validated cleaning method, you then need to make sure that when it's being applied, it is being applied successfully. And that can either be done through monitoring, which is more of the real-time verification, where you can use things like the visual inspection. You can use the lateral flow rapid detection swabs. Some people also use these protein swabs. In my experience, they're not really sensitive enough for the job, but it depends on your risk levels and your assessments. And then there's verification, which is sort of more longer term objective evidence to demonstrate that cleaning is working routinely. And this can take the form of analysis of results over maybe a period of months. And you can also look at trend analysis of hotspots within the factory. That's very useful. And finally, obviously, when it comes to cross-contamination, I think people are probably one of our biggest challenges. They're obviously an essential asset in the control of allergens, but they can be the downfall as well. I think the key is to train them and to show them about safe handling practices for allergens and make them aware of the consequences to an allergic consumer if they don't do it right. And I would recommend showing them a video like the one I showed you at the start of this presentation, and that certainly helps to bring home the message. In addition to that, training them on allergen handling and segregation procedures, on any restrictions on allergens being brought onto site by themselves or visitors, contractors or caterers, and then ensure that they're aware of the movement controls aimed at minimizing allergen cross-contamination through transfer on clothing, by hands, by footwear, and by equipment. And you may even like to consider the use of different staff for different allergen and non-allergen tasks. That brings us to product labeling, and many consumers are diligent, allergic consumers are diligent label readers, so these are really critical to them. They really depend on the information that's provided on the labels to avoid any food allergens in prepackaged foods. And of course, there are both legislative and standard requirements to cover the requirement for appropriate allergen labeling. In Canada, a regulatory amendment came to place in December 2016 in relation to the information provided in the contained statement that you have and precautionary allergen labeling. A food manufacturer that fails to comply with those regulations could be in violation of both the Food and Drugs Act and the Safe Foods for Canadians Act. And you can find out more about those legislations at the link shown. And of course, there are, again, requirements in the 3 largest global food safety schemes that are operating through GFSI with regard to product labeling and allergens. Despite all of that and food labeling, it's still a big issue, and food recalls due to inappropriate allergen labeling are far too common. A couple of years ago in the UK, a company called Pound Stretcher had to pay out nearly £31,000 after an allergen mislabeling prosecution. Now that's tough for Pound Stretcher, but is really nothing compared to the potential cost to human health. Now, in Canada and elsewhere, allergen precautionary labelling was identified as a judicious risk management measure, but it has become a little bit more contentious since it was first introduced. The idea was to address any instances of unavoidable allergen cross-contact and alert allergic consumers to the potential presence of undeclared allergens. Unfortunately, over time, its usefulness has become devalued, partly because of the consumer perception of its overuse and the inconsistent application of by the food industry. And there's global consensus among the various stakeholders that further guidance needs to be generated regarding the use of precautionary labelling. The Codex Committee on Food Labelling are working in this area, including looking at thresholds for food allergens. And as you heard earlier, I'm sure the Canadian government are involved and will keep you up to date with developments. More recently, and possibly even more worryingly, I was very concerned to read about the increasing practice of food manufacturers adding allergen to a food that didn't previously contain it. By adding the allergen and declaring it as an ingredient on the product label, the onus is then on the consumer to read the product label rather than on the manufacturer to avoid cross-contact. Now, although that might be legally acceptable, it doesn't seem to me to be very morally acceptable, especially if a consumer who has been safely consuming that product for many years is unaware of the new ingredient and then suffers as a consequence. I'd really welcome your thoughts on that. So in summary, effective allergen control requires a number of things. An understanding of why it's important, the establishment of site allergen management programs that consider preventing entry or restricting allergen entry, preventing cross-contact through a multi-factored approach, including all those things listed here, and appropriate and accurate labeling of the product. And all of this should be based on risk, and that risk is informed, or the risk assessment is informed using all the available resources available to you. And again, these are some of my go-to publications. They're from Camden, available from their website. I think these cover most of the areas that you need to look at in terms of allergen control. The cleaning and disinfection one is actually the most recent, having been revised, I think it was 18 months ago. We also have some additional information on our own website, which you're very welcome to have a look at. It's all available for download for free. And of course, you're very welcome to reach out to myself at any point. And if I can help you, I'd be very happy to do so. Thank you very much for listening. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but I'm very happy to take questions if we do.
Thank you so much, Deb. That was so informative, and always your presentations always have tons and tons of great information. So thank you again. One question that did come up is I did mention that the presentation will be posted in our members area as well as the recording. But we did have a question that if you are okay with others sharing it with their team members as well as other suppliers. So I didn't want to to answer that. So I just wanted to make sure you were okay with that.
Absolutely fine. Our approach on all of these things is to share this information as widely as possible. It's about food safety, and if we can improve food safety, then please, yes, share.
Awesome. Does anyone have any questions for Deb? I didn't see anything else in the chat.
Should we ask now, or we should put in the
Yes, go
chat?
ahead. Yep, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. It was great presentation. Here is
Thank you.
Sumesh. I'm from Rotterdam, Netherlands. So question is more about two specific topics. First one on the validations. So there is like different approaches for the validations in terms of considering worst case scenario. But from Canadian regulation point of view, or from the standard practice point of view, is there a standard validation protocol which is being referred or considered as a benchmarking, which we can just see like how it looks like?
I think that's where the EHEG guideline would be very useful for you, because they have gone through that process where they every single validation will be individual, so it will very much depend on your individual product, process, etc. But the principles of how to approach that validation have been outlined in that EHEG guideline. So I would strongly recommend that that would be my go-to to work through. It's going to be a long process, but it takes you through that process step by step, and is the closest that I'm aware of that's available in terms of a sort of standardized approach.
Yeah, very clear. Thanks. Second question was on the allergen labeling requirement in terms of like explicit dosing, like ED dosing, like 5, 10 or whatever. So like in terms of different type of allergens and different ED levels, is there any conscientious in terms of what's the label we should look or consider from different type of allergens?
So the labelling regulations vary from country to country, and they will all be laid out in the labelling legislation for that country. So really, you probably, well, you do need to abide by whatever the requirements are in that legislative information for your country. So if you're producing, you have to do it for the country that the food is sold and consumed in. So if you're producing in the Netherlands and you're exporting to Canada, they must meet the Canadian labelling regulations.
Yeah, to be very open, from a specific limit point of view, except gluten and I think sulfites, it's not
I see. Sorry,
very
yes, what you
clearly
mean.
defined.
No, it isn't. And that's one of the challenges that I was talking about in the early part of the presentation. What people want are those specified limits, as we have for sulfites and gluten, but it's very difficult to set those specified limits because of the variability in the reaction seen by different individuals. And that's where Vital is trying to come up with those threshold limits based on the clinical data that is now becoming available, and we're generating more and more of that all the time, to try to define those thresholds. But we don't have them yet, other than for gluten and sulfite, again, as far as I'm aware.
Very clear. Thanks very much.
Deb, I wanted to share with the group the workshop that you mentioned that you're doing at IFP. Is it the demystifying dry cleaning one?
That's the one. Yes.
That's one. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So for those of you that haven't registered yet for IFP, it is in Toronto this year at the Metro Convention Center in July. It is one of the best ways to stay up to date and current on what's happening in science and technology in our industry. And normally this is in the United States. So we're really lucky. The last time it was here was in Calgary in 2015, you said, Deb? Because I was it
Yes, yeah,
2015? Yeah.
2015 in Calgary,
So
yeah.
um I would take advantage, and also the workshops are very, very good. And in terms of the price point and the value that you get, you won't be getting that anywhere else. So I just shared the link in the chat there. If you have any questions about IFP or anything like that, you can feel free to reach out to OFPA as well. But all the information is on the IFP website. Deb, you had a question? Debbie?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
My question is, when do you know when working on thresholds, how are whoever's working on it accounting for the things that affect thresholds, such as health, exercise, menstruation, changes in your physiology for whatever reason?
Exactly. I think that's what they're doing is basing it on clinical study data. So hopefully they will be getting a range of people with different levels of health, different dietary preferences, different ages, and factoring that into the calculations that they're doing. But I have a concern, and probably it's the same concern as yourself, that not all of those are represented within that clinical study group that they're basing the data on, and that we might be missing people, and that the people we miss could be the very ones that are the most vulnerable and could still suffer with anaphylaxis or something, and not be with us anymore. So I think what they're just trying to do is improve the situation at the moment, but I think they also acknowledge that it's not perfect, and it's quite difficult to make it perfect given the variability we have within the human population in terms of our health, and our ages and everything else that contributes to how susceptible we are to anything, to disease, to a reaction from an allergen. So I think it's a best case. Let's try to improve the situation at the moment, but we know we're never going to be perfect. But let's also be aware that we're not perfect and make sure we don't miss those people that we shouldn't miss.
Yeah, it seems like there's so many moving parts to this that to me, it seems like they're spending so much time, energy, and money in an area with so many different factors affecting it that the time would be better spent elsewhere.
I tend to agree with you. There is an awful lot of work going on, and especially with the ILSIC group and the World Health Organization, they've put a lot of time and effort into this, pulling together expert groups. The information that they're pulling together is great. We just need to make sure that there is a caveat on it, that it's not all encompassing. And I think sometimes we can lose sight of that. I think overall, what I would say as well is that incidents of allergen reactions, which lead to the loss of life, are still relatively small in terms of risk compared with some of the other things that we experience on a day-to-day basis in our lives. So we do also need to put this whole thing in perspective, but that's no reason for us not still trying to do the best we can all the time.
No, and because, deaths are a very small part of it. I've been told in my community, 1 in 400 people in our long-term care facilities are people who had an anaphylactic reaction and didn't get epinephrine in time.
Wow.
So we've got young people who in there. One young man has been in there since he was 20, and he's now in his 40s. So it's also unintended consequences you forget about.
Yeah, absolutely, and long-term consequences as well. The video I showed at the beginning was actually one directed at young people who have an allergy sensitivity, to get them to carry their EpiPens with them, because they're often seen as not very cool things to carry. But if they then have an experience like the young lady in the video, if they don't have their EpiPen on them, then it can have the immediate dramatic effect, but then obviously those longer term effects that you were talking about. So I think there's also an educational piece here about making people who are allergen sensitive take some of their own care into their hands by carrying their EpiPens and making sure they're always prepared.
Thank
All
you.
right. It looks like we're just at the top of the hour. For those of you that are still on, I know we took a picture at the beginning, but if we wouldn't mind just putting on our cameras one last time, just because that we have a better view without the slide presentation, I'd appreciate that. Just really quickly.
To see all your lovely faces. It's so much nicer when you can see who you've been talking to.
Yeah. All right. Is that the best we're gonna get? All right. Okay, one. Oops.
Oh, hang on. There's a
Like I
few
said, I'm
more.
not very good at this, so we're gonna. One, two, three. All right. Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Deb, again for
very
your
welcome.
time and the information. We appreciate it.
I shall look forward to seeing you in Toronto.
Yes. See you then. Take care.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Okay, bye-bye.